She had nothing left. No family, no food, and barely a roof over her child's head. As the snow swallowed her home and the town turned its back, she prepared for one last night in the cold. But then, through the white silence, came a man no one really knew. A man who didn't speak. A man with scars and a cabin built for one. What happened next would change everything. The wind had teeth that morning. Sharp, bitter things that bit through the wooden seams of the cabin like wolves. Gnawing on tired bones, she stood by the hearth, poking at a weak fire with a stick too thin to stir it, wrapped in a blanket that had once belonged to her late husband. It smelled of moths and cold memories. The child coughed again, a dry, rasping sound that seemed too big for such a small chest. There was no more wood, no more meat, and the snow outside climbed halfway up the door, making the idea of fetching anything feel closer to suicide than survival. She checked the beams overhead. Another crack had split across the ceiling in the night. Water dripped in slow, rhythmic taps onto the dirt floor. She placed a tin cup beneath it, not because it helped, but because it made her feel like she hadn't given up. She hadn't always lived like this. There was a time when the townsfolk waved to her in the street, when her husband still carried buckets from the well, and their little girl had pink in her cheeks. But pneumonia had taken him last winter, and kindness had vanished with the spring. Now, the townspeople crossed the road to avoid her. Said she begged too often, that she should leave, find family elsewhere. But there was no elsewhere, just this one broken-down cabin, and a storm that hadn't stopped in 3 days. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at her daughter, sleeping beneath every blanket they owned. Her lips were pale, her skin clammy, and still she shivered. The woman's name didn't matter, not anymore, no one used it. Out here in the snow-covered nowhere, she was just her, the woman too proud to beg and too stubborn to die. Her hands ached with cold as she lifted the empty firewood basket. She opened the door with effort, pushing against snow that had frozen to the frame. The wind howled in like a scream trapped too long. She stepped out barefoot. Didn't matter. Now, numb was better than pain. She didn't get far, just past the edge of the porch, when her knees gave out. She knelt in the snow, not praying, just still. Like maybe if she didn't move, the sky would forget to drop more snow. Like maybe if she stayed quiet enough, the cold would pass over her and leave her be. That's when she saw it. A shape in the trees, tall, motionless, wrapped in a long coat faded to gray. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed the face. She blinked, unsure if it was real, but it didn't vanish. The man didn't speak, didn't move. He only watched for a while, like a ghost studying the last breath of a soul. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the white. But where he had stood, now sat a bundle. Firewood, fresh cut, dry. She dragged it inside with frozen fingers, lit a new fire, and for the first time in days, her daughter stopped shivering. She didn't know who he was, but somehow she knew. He'd be back. The fire crackled like something alive again. Her daughter lay beneath the blankets, her breath warm enough now to fog the tin mug near her face. But the woman couldn't rest. Not yet. The firewood, blessed as it was, wouldn't last more than 2 nights, and there was no promise he'd return. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe he'd given her all he had. Maybe she'd hallucinated him completely, and the wood was a gift from the storm itself. She wrapped herself in her husband's coat. It still smelled of horses and tobacco, and took the old sled from under the floorboards. With a rope tied at one end and nothing but hope tied to the other, she set off toward town. Each step sank deep into the snow, her boots cracking through the crust of ice beneath. The wind bit at her cheeks until they burned. Her hands ached, but her jaw clenched tighter. She didn't walk into town like a beggar. She walked like someone with just enough pride left to make people uncomfortable. The first place she tried was the general store. Old McAllister stood behind the counter, oil lamp flickering shadows up his jowls. He barely looked at her. "I got a sick child," she said, voice low. "If you got scraps, bones even, I'll work it off." He shook his head before she'd finished. "Ain't got room for charity today." "You sellin' firewood?" He shrugged. "Sold out yesterday." She nodded once, turned. She didn't plead. She wouldn't. Next, she stopped at the church. Pastor Reed was sweeping snow from the chapel steps, beard white as ash. He paused when he saw her, expression unreadable. She kept her voice steady. "My girl's sick. We could use some help." He looked down at her boots, cracked leather soaked through. "You didn't come Sunday. I couldn't leave her alone. There's others in need too," he said. "The Lord provides, but we're not his only flock." She felt the word stab, but said nothing. She nodded again and left. The wind picked up behind her, almost shoving her back the way she came. She stopped by 3 more homes. Doors stayed closed. Curtains moved. One woman peered out and then quietly blew out her lantern. When she reached the edge of town, the sled was as empty as when she'd come, except now it carried something heavier. Shame. She hadn't cried in weeks, but now tears burned her cheeks, mixing with snowflakes. Not from pity, from rage. Not a soul had asked her daughter's name. On the way back, near the bend in the road where the old pine split in two, she saw something. Again. The man, same long coat, same wide hat. His back was to her this time, kneeling by a tree. He looked like he was cutting something. She didn't call out, just stood there breathing hard. He turned slightly, looked at her. Still no words. But when he stood and stepped aside, there it was again. Another stack of wood. This time, bigger. She didn't ask why, didn't dare. He nodded toward it once, then walked up the hill in silence. She dragged the sled forward, heart pounding, not from the cold, but from something she couldn't name. Hope, maybe. And something deeper than that. Something quiet, something that watched, listened, and gave. The nights were still cruel, but now the fire didn't die before dawn. She chopped some of the wood herself, careful not to wake her daughter. Her hands blistered, but she didn't complain. The girl's cheeks had color again. That was enough. The woman didn't know what day it was. Time had collapsed under the snow, folding hours into a blur of cold and silence. But one thing had become clear. Someone was watching over them. Someone who didn't want thanks or prayers or even a name. She tried once to follow his tracks the morning after the second bundle, but the snow had already covered them. Gone, like a ghost. She began to notice little things. A rabbit skin left hanging from a low branch, a coil of twine left on a post. Every item useful, every gesture anonymous. The man never appeared close, but she felt him, like a mountain feels watched. By the moon. Then one afternoon she heard hooves, not one, many. She peered out through the window, heart rising, not with hope, but alarm. A cluster of riders was heading down the trail toward the cabins, men from town. She recognized at least 2. Her body tensed. She stepped outside before they could knock. They stopped their horses a few yards away, eyes sharp, mouths twisted with polite disapproval. One of them, a man named Deke Martin, tipped his hat but didn't smile. "Heard someone's been bringing you firewood." She said nothing. "Just making sure," he continued. "You ain't squatting on nobody's land." "This is my husband's claim," she said firm. "Since before the war." "He ain't alive," Deke replied. "And the way I heard it, someone else's. Cabin's been keeping you warm lately." Her blood ran colder than the air. They knew. But before she could answer, one of the horses snorted and backed a step. The men turned. At the edge of the trees he stood, the silent man, still as stone, one hand resting on the butt of his rifle, the other at his side. He didn't move forward, didn't speak, just stood there as if he'd grown out of the pines. The riders didn't laugh, didn't call out. Something in the air shifted. Deke cleared his throat. "Ain't looking for trouble." The man didn't blink. One by one the horses turned. The men followed, grumbling, their bravado fading with every hoofbeat in the snow. She stood in the silence that followed, chest heaving. When she turned back toward the trees, he was gone. That night she left a piece of cornbread on the stump by the road. It was gone by morning. The storm calmed, for a while. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Chop, carry, boil, feed. Her daughter began to laugh again, soft and hoarse. The woman began to hum. Quiet songs with no lyrics, just memory. But the cabin was still broken. The door, swollen from snow, refused to close fully now. It leaned on its hinges like an old man with one bad leg. Every night, She had to wedge firewood against it to keep out the wind. She patched leaks with cloth scraps and resin, but the cold found its way in like a thief. The only thing holding the place together now was Will. She had no intention of returning to town, not after the way they'd looked at her. The only trail she trusted now was the one that led to the ridge, the one he disappeared into. So one morning, when the sky was unusually clear and the wind merely cold instead of cruel, she bundled her daughter in every piece of warmth they had, kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll be back before the fire dies." Then she followed. The trail. It wasn't easy to find, but she'd learned to read it. How the snow dipped slightly where his boots had pressed. How tree limbs shifted subtly, as if bent with memory. She walked slowly, careful not to disturb what felt sacred. After a mile or so, the trees opened to reveal a structure tucked between two hills. A cabin, bigger than hers, stronger. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line. The roof had no sag. The door sat firm in its frame. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. She didn't knock. She just waited. Minutes passed, then the door opened. He stood there. Same wide hat, same worn coat. He didn't look surprised. She raised a hand in a small, almost awkward wave. "I just wanted to see," she said, her voice tight. "Where you go?" He didn't reply, just stepped aside. She hesitated, then stepped forward. Inside, the warmth was steady. The space simple, neat. A single bed in the corner, tools hung with care, a rifle on the wall. A cast iron pot simmered on a low fire. He handed her a wooden cup, something hot inside. She sipped it. Strong, bitter, but warm. Still no words. They sat like that for a while. Two people with too many memories and no one left to hear them. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you for the wood." And the silence. His eyes flicked, just for a second. Then he stood, walked to a corner and picked something up. A wooden plank, planed and clean. He walked past her, out the door. She followed. He pointed down the hill toward her cabin. The plank was for her door. He didn't ask. He just started walking. He walked ahead of her with that same steady rhythm, measured, silent, almost mechanical. The wooden plank rested across his shoulder, but he moved as if it weighed no more than the snow on his coat. She didn't speak as they walked. Neither did he. Words had lost their place between them. Out here, language had been replaced by something quieter. The way he glanced back to make sure she followed. The way she adjusted her pace to match his. Even the wind seemed to hush as they climbed the ridge. When they reached her cabin, she suddenly saw it through his eyes. The door leaned to one side, bruised and waterlogged. The windows were patched with cloth and wax paper. The roof sagged like a tired back. It looked less like a home and more like a last stand. Still, smoke puffed from the chimney. Her daughter's face appeared at the window for a second. Eyes wide, then gone. The man set the plank down near the door, crouched beside the frame, and ran his gloved fingers along the wood. His gaze was sharp but calm. She could almost hear him thinking, not in words but in solutions. No judgment, just action. He stood again and looked around, spotted her tools stacked beside the firewood. Without asking, he grabbed the hammer and a rusted tin of nails. She watched from the side, arms crossed against the cold. He worked methodically, pulling the door free with a few sure strikes. Every movement was precise, like someone who'd done this before, many times. She wanted to help, but didn't. He didn't need help. He needed space. The minutes passed, with only the sound of wood on wood, metal on metal, the occasional grunt as he drove a stubborn nail through a knot. By the time he finished, the new door swung into place, clean and solid. She reached out, pressed it gently. Click. It shut fully, quietly, without resistance. The sound nearly made her cry. He picked up the broken remains of the old door and leaned them against the side of the cabin, then dusted off his gloves and started walking back the way they came. She stepped forward, heart racing for reasons she didn't fully understand. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice soft, barely above the wind. "There's stew, and it's warm." He stopped, didn't turn, didn't nod. But after a moment he came back. Inside, the air smelled of herbs and boiled potatoes. She lit a second candle and placed a chipped bowl on the table across from Her daughters. The girl stared wide-eyed as he entered, silent as a shadow. He took off his hat but not his coat, sat without a word and ate slowly. He didn't compliment the food, didn't glance around the cabin, but something about the way he took each bite, deliberate, steady, felt like trust. Her daughter reached across the table with a tiny hand, offering him a button she'd found earlier in the snow. Shiny, useless. He looked at it, looked at the girl, then took it, and placed it carefully in his pocket. The woman felt her breath hitch. After the meal, he stood, refilled the kettle with snow, then walked to the door. He paused before leaving, hand resting on the new wood he'd placed. He didn't look back. But before he stepped out, he touched the brim of his hat. Just once. That night the wind howled again, but it didn't come through the cracks. And for the first time in weeks, she slept. Not in fear, but in waiting. The days that followed felt different. Not warmer. Winter still clung to the land with claws of ice, but quieter. Like the storm had shifted from the sky to somewhere softer, internal. He came back. Not every day, but often enough that she stopped flinching at footsteps. In the snow, he never knocked, never waited, just appeared, sometimes near dusk, sometimes at dawn, carrying small things, a sack of oats, a spool of thread, a bag of nails, a tin of dried berries. Always things they needed, never things they asked for. The woman began to prepare an extra bowl without thinking. The girl began to sit taller when he entered, her cough fading into giggles. Once she offered him a drawing, 2 stick figures under a tree, one tall with a wide hat. He took it without a word, folded it, tucked it into his coat like it was gold. He spoke once. She was mending a tear in her daughter's coat by the fire when she asked softly, "You live up there alone?" He stared at the flames a moment. Then, "They left me." Just that. She didn't ask who they were, didn't press. The silence that followed was heavier than snow but didn't feel cruel. It felt sacred, like she'd been given a piece of something rare. She told him her name that night, not because he asked, but because the silence had grown too tender to leave unnamed. "Claire," she said while drying her daughter's hair. He looked up, nodded once. It was enough. One morning she found a rabbit already skinned and cleaned hanging by the door. Another day, the broken chair near the hearth had been repaired overnight. He came and went like a shadow. But shadows don't build shelves, don't mend boots, don't carry sick children during the night when they cry out in fevered dreams. He did. One evening, a sudden wind burst the back window open, shattering the last pane of glass in the house. She rushed to cover it with burlap, hands shaking. The girl cried. He was there within the hour, nailed fresh boards, sealed the edges with wax. Never spoke, never even took his coat off. But before leaving, he turned to the girl and handed her something wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly. Inside was a carved wooden horse, rough but detailed. Her small fingers traced the lines of the mane. "Did you make this?" Claire asked, surprised. He didn't answer, but his hand twitched slightly, then dropped. Later that night, after her daughter fell asleep clutching the horse to her chest, Claire stood by the fire alone. She looked at the door. It was closed, locked. The wind stayed out, and yet her chest felt too full. She wasn't sure if it was grief or gratitude, or something else entirely. Something fragile, forming in silence. The wind howled again that night, pressing against the cabin like a drunk trying to force his way in. But the walls held. The roof didn't leak. The door didn't rattle. Inside, the silence was warm. Claire stirred the stew with one hand, the other gently combing through her daughter's damp hair. The girl had fallen asleep on the rug, the wooden horse tucked under one arm like a secret. Across the room, he sat in the chair by the fire. His chair now, though no one had ever called it that aloud. He'd taken off his coat earlier, hung it on the peg near the door. It was the first time she'd seen him without it. His shirt was plain but worn thin in spots. One sleeve was rolled up slightly, revealing a forearm lined with old scars, some straight, some jagged, like stories half erased. But it was his back that made her pause. She turned her head just slightly, pretending to check the pot. Her eyes lingered. Across his shoulder blades, beneath the fabric that clung to him in firelight, were lines. Deep, harsh, unnatural. Not from a fall, Not from a fight. Whip marks. Old. Faded, but unmistakable. She said nothing, but inside her something shifted. A weight she hadn't known she carried slid into place, like a puzzle piece finally understanding where it belonged. He had been hurt, by people, by systems, by something he still didn't speak of. He turned slightly, sensing her stare. Their eyes met. She didn't look away, neither did he. There was no shame in his expression, no pride either, just stillness. Like he'd lived with those scars for so long, they no longer stung. "I was in Yuma once," she said quietly. "My husband was stationed there for a season." He didn't respond, but his jaw tensed. "I remember the sound the chains made from the prisoners on the work line. I used to hear them at night. My husband said not to think too hard about it." Still no answer, but he stood slowly, walked over to the window and looked out. The snow had started again, soft, gentle flakes like falling feathers. The kind of snow that didn't scream but whispered. "Did you escape?" she asked, barely above a breath. He didn't move for a long time. Then finally, "They let me go. After 11 years. Said I wasn't worth keeping anymore." Claire's eyes stung, not from smoke. She walked over, stood beside him. Close, but not touching. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, heavy, alive. "You're worth keeping," she said. The words felt too bold the moment they left her lips, but she didn't take them back. He didn't reply, just looked at her, and in that look there was no fear, no deflection. Just a man who'd been broken and built again with wood, silence, and quiet acts of care. They came just after sunrise. 5 riders, wrapped in layers of fur and suspicion, their horses snorting clouds of steam as they approached the cabin. The sound of hooves on frozen ground was enough to rattle the spoons in the cupboard. Claire stepped outside before they reached the porch, her arms folded tightly over her chest. Not from fear, but from resolve. She knew why they were here. She knew how this town worked. When it couldn't own something, it tried to ruin it. Deke Martin led the group. Same slick hair, same smug voice, barely hiding the rot beneath. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "Heard you've had company." She didn't answer. He glanced at the repaired door, the smoke rising steadily from the chimney, the boot prints in the snow leading to and from the hills. "Looks like someone's been shacking up where they don't belong." Claire kept her gaze steady. "We're not bothering anyone." "That's the thing, miss," Deke replied, swinging one leg over his saddle and dropping to the ground. "He don't belong here. Ain't no law says he can stay. Ain't no law says you can keep him either." A second man laughed. "Folks talk, you know. Say he's an escaped convict. Say he killed men, burned farms." "Let them talk," Claire snapped, sharper than she intended. "They weren't the ones who brought us food when we were starving, or cut wood when the baby was coughing blood." "Maybe he was buying your silence," Deke said. "Or worse." She took a step forward. "He gave us nothing he didn't build with his own hands. Nothing he didn't leave at the door." The others began to dismount. One pulled a rope from his saddlebag. Claire's heart pounded. And then he appeared. At first it was just the sound, boots crunching through frost, a coat brushing past dry branches. But the men heard it too. Heads turned. He stepped from the trees like something carved from the earth itself. Coat unbuttoned, hat low, rifle slung over his shoulder but not raised. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough to drain the heat from the men's faces. He walked past Claire, slow and even, and stood at the base of the steps. Just stood there, watching. Deke shifted on his feet. "We don't want no trouble." No reply. The man let his hand rest on the rifle, not menacing, just a reminder. "Just making sure she's safe, that's all," Deke muttered. Claire laughed once, sharp and bitter. "Safe? From you?" They backed off, one by one, mounting slowly, eyes flicking between the silent man and the woman beside him. When they rode off, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, Claire turned to him. "You didn't have to come down here." His eyes didn't leave the horizon. "I always come when it snows." She blinked. "Why?" He looked at her then. "Really?" "Looked. Because that's when people get left behind." After the men rode off, the world didn't return to silence. It settled into it. like even the wind had seen what passed between them and chosen to stand still a while longer. Claire watched him for a moment, not as a stranger, not even as a savior, but as a man who had stayed. That night he didn't leave. He sat by the fire after the girl had fallen asleep, his coat folded neatly over the back of the chair. Claire offered him a cup of coffee, and he took it with the smallest nod. They didn't talk, but words weren't necessary anymore. The crackling of the fire, the gentle hiss of snow melting on the roof, these were the things they understood. Outside, the snow kept falling, but softer now, almost gentle. Inside, time bent around them. The next morning, she found him splitting, wood in the yard before dawn, sleeves rolled, hair damp from snow. He moved like a man who had known labor his whole life, and chose it, not for survival, but for meaning. She made 3 cups of tea, one for her daughter, and one for the man who had no name but had built a place in their lives like a second hearth. Later that day, she caught him quietly reinforcing the back wall of the cabin. She hadn't asked, but he had noticed the way it shifted in the wind. She began to set out his tools without being told. He fixed what was weak. She planted what could grow. By the end of the week, the snow had started to melt in streaks, and the first signs of earth peeked through near the base of the porch. Claire took it as a sign. She cleared a small patch by the side of the cabin and pressed seeds into the cold soil. Herbs mostly, left from last spring. Maybe they'd take, maybe they wouldn't. He didn't ask what she was doing, just watched, then handed her a pail of water without a word. One night, as her daughter slept, she found herself tracing the curve of a wooden spoon he'd carved. The edges were rough, but the care was there. In the shape, the balance, the way it rested in her hand as if it had always belonged. She stepped outside and found him sitting on the porch, smoking a long-forgotten pipe. He didn't look up, but she sat beside him anyway. "I think she likes you," Claire whispered. Still silence. "But she's just a child. She hasn't learned how to be afraid of what she doesn't understand." Finally he spoke, voice low, rasped. "Neither have you." She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back and watched the stars appear through the thinning clouds. The night was still cold, but it no longer pressed in. It wrapped around them like a heavy quilt stitched with silence and shared breath. The weight of warmth was heavier than the cold had ever been, and she was learning to carry it. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like a man uninvited but needed. The snow thinned, the roof stopped groaning. The nights held, warmth longer, and the firewood stack began to shrink slower than it grew. Claire stood outside one morning, her boots sinking gently into soft earth instead of ice. The garden she'd planted showed timid green shoots. Life, again, where death had camped. She turned to find her daughter chasing a butterfly, and him, quiet, as always, repairing the chicken coop that hadn't held chickens in 2 winters. He hadn't left once since the day the men came. There was no discussion about it, no deal made, no question asked. He just stayed. Some nights he still returned to his own cabin, but more often than not, she'd find him asleep in the corner chair, arms crossed, hat tilted low, not guarding, not intruding, just present. She'd started setting out his things in the morning, his spoon, his cup, a clean cloth, not because she was playing house, but because somehow he already lived here. One evening, Claire found her daughter sitting on the floor beside him, watching him whittle. He was carving something slowly, with intent. A small figure, an animal maybe. The girl didn't speak, just watched, as if memorizing every movement of his hands. Later that night, Claire asked, "Do you miss being alone?" He thought for a moment. Then, "I was never alone. I was just left behind." She didn't speak again, just crossed the room and placed a folded blanket beside the fire. A small gesture, a simple one. But when she turned, he was looking at her, not like a man who needed help, but like one who'd finally found someone who saw him. The next morning, Claire opened the door to find something new. A signpost freshly planted at the edge of the clearing. It had no words, just a small carving at the top. 3 figures, one tall, one small, one in the middle. Side by side, she traced her fingers over the wood. breath-catching. That afternoon, she packed what little they had left at the old cabin, the broken tools, the rusted pans, and carried them up the ridge. He didn't ask why, he simply cleared a space inside. That night, as rain tapped against the sturdy roof of his cabin, now their cabin, Claire tucked her daughter into a bed built for two and stood beside the fire with a full heart. The man stirred from his seat and walked to the door, paused, looked back. He didn't say, "You're home now." He didn't need to. She was already home, because home wasn't walls. It was hands that stayed, and silence that held you when words never could.
Before you go, if this story stirred something quiet in you, a memory, a hope, or simply a reminder that even in silence, kindness speaks the loudest, take a moment and leave a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you. Your words might be the warmth someone else needs tonight. And if you believe the world could use more stories like this, hit subscribe. It means more than you know. It tells us you're listening. It tells us to keep going, and we will, from all of us. Here, thank you for watching. We'll be here, waiting, with the next story that just might stay with you forever.